Good afternoon and welcome. My name is John Pilot. I'm the Assistant Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our viewers. I'm so pleased that you're joining us this afternoon for our program today, Once Elite, Always Elite: How Prestige Survives in a Changing World. Please note, this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's vodcast library in a week or so. We received many questions in advance of the program that have been shared with our speaker. If you have a question during the presentation today, you may enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, I will take a moment to introduce our faculty speaker. Professor Christi Lockwood conducts research on the interplay of organizational and societal cultures, especially in processes of cultural entrepreneurship, collective meaning-making, and institutional change. She is particularly interested in understanding how organizations and other collective actors use culture to adapt to shifting environmental demands and elicit positive social evaluations from audiences. As a field researcher, Professor Lockwood's work is situated in rich, diverse contexts, ranging from U.S. luxury hotels to the response to the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. Since beginning her academic career, before beginning her academic career, Professor Lockwood worked in the hotel industry and in management consulting. Thank you for joining us. Professor Lockwood, I invite you to begin your presentation today.
Think for a moment about the institutions and organizations we take for granted as elite. Swiss watchmakers like Patek Philippe and Blancpain, universities like Cambridge and Oxford, Harvard, Yale, UVA, the Bordeaux and Champagne wine houses. What these producers have in common is not just elite status, but also remarkable staying power as elite. Each has stood at the top of its domain, not for decades, but for centuries. That's especially striking when we note that the average organization survives only about 8 years. Over those centuries, tastes have shifted, rivals have risen and fallen. What's counted as prestigious in one era, in some cases, has come to look almost embarrassing in the next. And so the remarkable thing, the remarkable durability of these producers begs the question, how do these groups of organizations stay on top when so much is changing all around them? I'm Christi Lockwood, Associate Professor of Management at the McIntire School of Commerce here at UVA, and that's the question we'll be examining in our time together today as we ask, once elite, always elite? We'll examine together how prestige survives in a changing world, drawing on extensive historical data that I've collected from the US hotel industry. Now, before we dive in, I want to take a moment first to thank all of you for being here with us today, to thank Lifetime Learning for inviting me to share this work, and to thank my co-authors on this work, Professors Marianne Glynn and Simona Georgi, for their contributions and for allowing me to share this. I'm really delighted to spend some time doing so today. So let's dig in. Our starting point for this work was the recognition that scholars have long observed that elite status, once achieved, tends to stick. As one widely cited group of researchers put it, once a status hierarchy is established, it tends to remain and to be virtually self-sustaining. And empirically, that's clearly true. Elite organizations and elite market categories do endure. Swiss brands haven't fallen out of the watch world, the Ivy League hasn't dropped out of the university elite, and Bordeaux hasn't given up its place at the top of the wine list. But what past work has told us is only that these elite categories endure. What it fails to explain is how. And treating endurance as inevitable as a kind of inertia misses something really important because behind the endurance of elite status that has been widely observed, as it turns out, a great deal of cultural work that until now has not. That gap between observing endurance and explaining it is what my colleagues and I set out to address. Together with Professors Glynn and Georgie, we asked, how do elite market categories endure? Now, this is an intriguing puzzle because it's easy to see that elite categories are not immune to threats. Their clientele shifts. Rivals may encroach from below, as when quartz timepieces threatened mechanical Swiss watches. And as this depiction of shifting tastes from Time magazine in the 1950s captures, broader cultural tastes and values can also shift in ways that make what was once prestigious feel profoundly out of step. So simply observing the endurance of elite categories isn't enough to explain it. So we sought to understand this active work going on to keep these elite categories on top. To get at the how, we needed a long historical lens so we could really assess and take stock of this endurance and also see change and sort of variability over time. So to do that, we chose to focus on US luxury hotels. This is a category that's existed continuously in this country for over 225 years. It's also an ideal setting because the economic value of luxury hotels is based in large part on their cultural value, which from a research perspective is really valuable because it helps to illuminate and make these cultural dynamics of interest most observable. So we worked with about 16,000 pages of historical archival material that I hand collected from a wide variety of sources. The New York Times from 1850s through 2015, articles from the trade press like those you see depicted here, including AAA ratings and the Hotel Monthly, 25 expert interviews with hoteliers and longtime industry experts and observers, and on-site observations at luxury hotels, as well as at field configuring conferences, where in many cases the meaning of luxury was being actively debated and worked out in real time. So as researchers, we combined a close qualitative reading of every page of each of these data sources with computational text analysis, which allowed us to look at the full corpus of texts and look at trends within and across sources and over time, over this full period of 225 years. So the patterns that I'll share in my findings are grounded both in careful interpretation as well as in systematic analysis of the full text corpus. So perhaps the most immediate thing that emerged from our analysis was the recognition that there were three rough periods that demarcated the industry's history, the luxury hotel category's history over time. The first was the Grand Hotel period, when luxury meant opulent palaces of the public. That proceeded into the chain hotel period, when luxury meant a standardized science of service delivered at global scale. And today we find ourselves in the lifestyle hotel period, when luxury has come to mean authentic, bespoke experiences that are deeply rooted in place and in history. Now, across these three time periods, there's one central conceptual idea that I'll be returning to over the course of the presentation and that organizes sort of everything that follows. The idea is that there is a symbolic distinction between luxury and everything else in the industry that sets luxury apart at the top of the industry hierarchy, and that has helped to secure its place there from early on in the industry's history, setting it apart from inns and taverns, and that continues to distinguish it from other closer competitors today. In our work, we call this luxury's symbolic boundary. A symbolic boundary is the set of oppositional meanings and practices that distinguish elite from non-elite. That, in other words, allow us to agree this is luxury and this is not. Now, crucially, the basis of these distinctions is not just price. Price is a part of it, but it's just one small piece. Instead, these distinctions are really about the whole package. Who stays at luxury hotels, what the decor looks like and signals, what kind of services performed in the hotel, even where the building sits in the city, how journalists and insiders and guests and critics talk about the hotel. In other words, the symbolic boundary is fundamentally cultural. So to preview our findings just a little bit, we find that an elite symbolic boundary, in essence, has to hold two things in tension at the same time. And these two things are oppositional to one another in many ways. On the one side, there's exclusivity, a sense that this is not for everyone. On the other side, there's cultural consonance, the sense that this fits with what broader society currently values. If we tip too far towards exclusivity, the category starts to look out of touch. At the same time, if we tip too far towards consonance, the category stops looking elite at all. So the crux of the whole story you're about to hear is the story of how this balance keeps shifting and how the category has had to reinvent itself twice to maintain that balance. So let's begin at the industry's very start, when luxury hotels first emerged. So picture the setting. The country has just won its independence. Most Americans are still farmers, and public lodging is rough. Taverns where strangers sometimes share beds. So into that world, a brand new kind of building begins to appear gradually and then at a quicker pace in major US cities. It's grand, it's opulent, and it's really unlike anything Americans, or the world for that matter, has ever seen. These first luxury hotels marketed themselves quite openly as palaces of the public, and the royalty they pursued were the individuals and families at the very top of American society. A Boston paper in 1829 described the ideal clientele for these luxury hotels as none but genteel company. So who actually stayed there? Well, it was the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans, families whose names we all still recognize. And indeed, this first generation of luxury hotels was palatial. They were often the largest buildings in their locale and highly ornate. Inside, the decor was distinctive too. Tessellated marble, fluted columns, an army of servants ready to serve hand and foot. Thus, in clientele and in appearance, these early luxury hotels very clearly signaled their exclusivity. But at the same time, luxury was also progressive. In a technical sense, for one, they were often on the cutting edge. They introduced things like running water, gaslight, elevators, telegraph service, for instance, well before those things became ordinary in most American homes. But they were also, in many ways, socially progressive. So unlike elite European lodging, which often took the shape of private estates and literal family castles, American luxury hotels were open to anyone that could afford to stay there. Further, their lobbies were true public spaces. Ordinary people were welcome to walk in, to sit on the velvet, to watch the elite drift past. This served a function in putting patrons' wealth on display, deliberately so, and it helped to draw a social partition around those who belonged in plain sight of those who didn't, at least not outside of the hotel's lobby. Encoding luxury hotels as palaces of the public in this way decisively set them apart from their alternatives, the inns and taverns that served the general populace. These were seen as commonplace and basic. They were patronized by clients who were seen as unrefined and tasteless, who were often forced to share beds and who faced unsanitary conditions in the private homes that served as the primary type of non-luxury lodging in this era. So, holding together exclusive entitled wealth on the one hand and culturally consonant ideals of public progressivism on the other, luxury hotels were clearly distinct from taverns and inns, and they soon became symbols of the young nation itself. The historian James Williamson, reflecting on the hotel's history in 1930, called them the thermometer and barometer of our national civilization, the most distinctively American of all our institutions, which is quite a statement considering the plethora of institutions that were established in the United States over this same period. But the settlement was fragile. By the early 1900s, the very things that had defined grand hotel luxury were starting to come under attack. The modern progressive movement turned public sentiment towards the plight of the common man and against displays of wealth. Inequality was at near record levels. So what had been called grand was now called pretentious and showy. One observer in 1936 reflected on this period and wrote that visiting a hotel had become a moral holiday and that the lobby would make a good inferno. What had once been seen as progressive was now seen as deeply out of touch and, in fact, profoundly immoral, really fundamentally misaligned with the cultural sentiments of the time. Meanwhile, another threat was emerging, not from sociocultural changes, but from within the industry from below. Starting in 1908, E.M. Statler introduced the chain hotel model to the middle market, where there really wasn't much happening until this point. Statler hotels were not fancy and gilded. Rather, they were revolutionary in bringing standardization, consistency, and fair pricing to middle-class travelers. In doing so, they claimed the progressive mantle for themselves, the very mantle that grand hotels had once worn. So by the 1930s, the luxury hotels of the Grand Hotel period were nearly extinct. The Drake in Chicago, the Plaza in New York, even the Waldorf Astoria, they all faced financial insolvency. Writing in 1957, an industry historian in the New York Times flatly observed that by the 1930s, luxury hostelries had become practically extinct. Now, this gives us maybe our big first lesson, or our first big lesson. The elements that defined the boundary that distinguished luxury at one moment had become the very things that disrupted it later. Entitlement and opulence were strengths in 1880, but by 1920, they were deep liabilities. The boundary that had held these elements in balance couldn't hold any longer. Out of that crisis, luxury was reinvented. The chain hotel period from the end of the 1920s through the 1990s is when luxury came to mean cosmopolitanism, standardized excellence delivered at global scale. So, this is the era of the Four Seasons, the Ritz-Carlton, the Hyatt, names you know well. And there's a deep irony at the heart of all of it. Luxury in this era survived by borrowing from non-luxury and then adapting those elements to an upscale clientele tied to a long legacy of high-end hostelries. So let me unpack this here. Lucius Boomer, the manager of the Waldorf Astoria, actually led the way. He looked to the principles of scientific management advanced by Ford, the car manufacturer, and others, and fitted those same principles of scientific management to luxury hotels. In practice, this meant, for instance, moving from 30 pieces of crystal to a standardized set of 10, moving from a different design in every hotel room to a consistent look and feel throughout a hotel. It meant systematizing service interactions so that servers and guests alike knew what to expect and how to recognize good service. And different from competitors who had hidden these efforts away from customers, Boomer was the first to really make standardization central to luxury and to make it visible to guests. Boomer wrote of this approach, "It's only by standardizing the methods of serving that the impression of perfectly personal and individual attention can be given." Thus, Boomer makes standardization no longer the enemy of personal service, but instead the source of it. So, this consistent lavishness is translated into global excellence, a worldwide gold standard. The same Ritz feeling, for instance, whether you check in Boston or in London or in Tokyo. And this becomes an approach that over the course of this period expanded so that it was reflected in standard operating procedures that luxury hotels use consistently at check-in, for instance, or a wealth of high-end amenities like a pool and a restaurant on site and a business center that came to be expected of luxury hotels in this period too. And as much as luxury became about excellence and opulence, standardization was also central to making luxury about reliability. This era saw the rise of branded chains like Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton, whose business model was centrally based on professional management and consistency. And with the introduction of the AAA Diamond rating system and the mobile rating system, along with the rise of specialized hospitality schools like Cornell and training programs, luxury suddenly wasn't just an art, it was something that you could measure and certify, and maybe most importantly, something that you could scale across the globe. And the clientele changed to match. The new royal family, as the New York Times put it in the 1980s, became corporate, not aristocratic. It was chairmen and presidents of companies, high-powered lawyers, as the Times put it, our version of the royal family. Jet travel after the 1950s made global business trotters wealthy and particularly mobile. And so opulence still mattered, but now it was really about consistent opulence. Marble, brass, deep carpets, every property across the globe aligned to consistent brand standards. It ushered in what the New York Times explicitly noted as a new era of luxury. And they captured this recombination of corporatization and opulence as an original métis that hangs just over a Dow Jones ticker. Now, against this code stood the new non-luxury baseline, which I've pictured here on the right. This is common, economical, unreliable, and fragmented. Think here highway motels, mom and pop operations that were cast in opposition to luxury and offering no consistent quality or reliability. Notice here too the inversion. Whereas in the early 1900s, standardization had been characteristic of non-luxury, now it was central to being elite, and non-luxury was associated with fragmentation and a lack of corporate backing. So luxury had achieved a similar balancing act as before, just held in a new mix. Now it was exclusivity in marble lobbies and corporate clients, alongside culturally consonant efficiency and scientific management with these global standards. And once again, the settlement carried the seeds of its own undoing. By the 1990s, the artisanal movement, which valorized craft, small batch production, and localization, was turning public taste against mass production, against the very standardization that had become central to luxury over the prior decades. So the consistency and indeed the opulence that had once been an asset of luxury became overstretched with luxury standards that were highly specified, as you can see, and very rigid, and maybe most importantly, very easy to imitate, even by lower tier competitors. Luxury was also increasingly about lavish features that, although they were costly to implement and to reproduce across the world, were ultimately seen as excessive and not really all that special. The journalist Dana Thomas, writing in 2007, captured the mood at this time. Luxury, she said, by the 1990s had sacrificed its integrity, undermined its products, tarnished its history, and stripped away all that made it special as it sought or pursued the science of service. Now, then came the 2008 financial crisis, and corporate opulence became actively toxic, coded in the press as extravagance, waste, and politically incorrect decision making. So here, once again, we see similar themes as we saw in the shift from the grand hotel period to the chain hotel period. There's this sentiment of a lack of morality, a disconnect with the prevalent cultural values of the time as they had shifted. And as luxury was becoming out of step with prevailing cultural sentiment, as it had in the prior transition between periods, here again, we also see a second threat that arises from within the industry again. The 1980s and 1990s had witnessed the rise of small boutique hotels, those like Morgan's focused on design, unique experience, and local embeddedness. These new types of hotels had the personality and sense of place that were consonant with changing tastes, that resonated with this emerging artisanal movement, and they began quietly drawing the most sophisticated travelers away from luxury hotels and into their own doors. So once again, luxury was being outflanked from below. Notice here again the same pattern as a century earlier. The elements that had defined the boundary at one moment became the very things that disrupted it later. Lavishness and efficiency were strengths mid-century, but as the century neared its end, they had become liabilities. The boundary that had once held these elements in balance couldn't hold any longer. By the early 2000s, one observer summed it up in 5 short words. Luxury has become a negative. The category was in crisis for the second time in its history. Daily rates plummeted, and occupancy saw the greatest decline ever recorded. And for a time, it was unclear how luxury or whether luxury would survive. Out of that second crisis, luxury was reinvented again. This was the start of the lifestyle hotel period, which began in the late 1990s and continues through today, where luxury means originality, authentic, bespoke, rooted in place and in history. Again, this is the era we're living in right now. Think Amman, Rosewood, the luxury collection. And this time, in order to move forward, luxury reaches back into its own past to find some of the raw material for renewal. The new luxury code in this period rests on iconicity and authenticity in the sense of going back generations and generations in ways that can credibly draw on a long and storied past. The history of the hotel itself now becomes a much more central part of the luxury experience. So consider, for example, how the Waldorf Astoria collection, a new hotel brand created in this era about 15 years ago, justifies and elevates its existence by drawing heavily on nostalgia, putting forth a stylized version of its history. So in online collateral, the brand highlights the original Waldorf's role in setting a standard for luxury hospitality, in serving as a destination for dignitaries, presidents, and celebrities, and how it ultimately cemented its reputation as the greatest of them all, as it was famously dubbed by Conrad Hilton. This campaign uses this history to situate and distinguish the new collection, which includes now 20 hotels around the world that are positioned as extraordinary places that together offer a singular, unique experience, a positioning that is very much in line with broader notions of luxury that were emerging at the time. This approach is not limited just to the Waldorf Astoria collection. It's echoed across the industry. Hotels begin to put forth historian-curated narratives and to publish their own institutional histories. Employees are no longer servers, but storytellers, both about the hotel's history and the locale, as reflected in the image on the right from the luxury collection. Notice that we now see very little of the hotel itself in images like this one, and much more of its history and the local community reflected. And when hotels lacked a storied history, they just invented it. Orient Express, pictured on the left here, was a chain hotel that was founded in 1976. It is a chain hotel. It's still around today. No real heritage to draw on, though. So they created the fictional Astorbilts, a deliberate play on Astor and Vanderbilt, and in their ad campaigns followed their imagined adventures, creating an idealized image of the gentility of the past that they could then leverage to frame luxury for contemporary travelers. And this isn't, by the way, it's not just about marketing. The idea of authenticity and iconicity gets baked into stay experiences in ways that it never was before. Aesthetic materials in hotels are now subtle, they're varied, they're distinctively high quality, reflective of the locale and the hotel's own history. Service becomes more tailored to the local market, so that what luxury hospitality looks like in Hawaii is no longer consistent, but decidedly different from what you'd get in New York, for instance. And we see the return of lobbies and bars and workspaces that no longer cloister away business travelers who are the elites, but instead welcome the local community in. In this way, the iconicity and authenticity of luxury with its storied past also ties into a new clientele, travelers whose good taste evokes the wealth of yore, as the New York Times put it, but whose behavior is contemporary, prioritizing experiences over material possessions and a shift away from this over-the-top extravagance that characterized the chain hotel period. Now, to that end, luxury also shifts to tailor to a new clientele. It's not just those with inherited wealth, as in the Grand Hotel period, or corporate executives, as in the chain hotel period. Now it's a more diverse upper class, tech founders, global creatives, accomplished experts in their fields, those whose status derives not from entitlement, but now from earned privilege. This new elite class signals status through varied interests, not through a single expression of status. So this is something that brands like the luxury collection capture quite directly with their global explorers, who included entrepreneurs, chefs, artists, designers, models, and much, much more. These individuals shared how travel inspired them in their careers, in their own explorations, and their broader attitudes towards the world. So, as Graham Hill put it, one of the global explorers for the luxury collection, it's about seeing the world differently. Luxury travel is about seeing things in a different way and ideally taking some of that with you when you come back. Finally, to appeal to these privileged guests and their diverse tastes and takes on luxury, luxury itself also became more focused than ever on bespoke, tailored experiences. St. Regis brought back the personal butler. The luxury collection employed concierges from Le Clé d'Or, a century-old international network of concierges. Even the AAA rating system shifted in the mid-2000s away from being a prescriptive checklist to being a more descriptive reflection of what is typically seen in luxury hotels. This granted luxury hotels much more flexibility to tailor to guests, so customization replaces standardization as the elite signal, and that's reflected in language used by luxury hotels themselves. In advertisements, for instance, that newly focus on unique experiences and on the guests themselves rather than on the hotels. Let us stay with you, as Ritz-Carlton says, or let us be your guide, as the luxury collection invites. Now, against this code stands the new non-luxury baseline: unremarkable, common, generic, and contrived. And here's the crucial part. The practices that now characterize non-luxury, standardization, consistency, corporatization, are precisely those that 30 years ago defined luxury. The boundary has shifted around those practices again and recast them as non-elite. An industry voice in the early 2000s put it well. Luxury is shifting from a picture of glamour and opulence to an inspiration of comfortable class. And as the luxury hotel period continues to unfold, industry experts have widely agreed that luxury has changed, and that the luxury segment, the luxury category, is now far better defined than 15 years ago, as meanings and practices continue to settle, and as luxury continues to retain its elite place at the top of the industry's hierarchy, just as it always has. So, having moved descriptively from 1790 until present day, we've covered a lot of ground. So now let's pull back. We've watched the category reinvent itself twice over the span of 225 years, but we've really talked in a lot of detail and nuance. So what did that actual reinvention work look like? What are the conceptual mechanisms and processes that allow this reinvention work to be effective, to really unfold? So building from our findings, my co-authors and I identified a more general process that constructs this boundary between luxury and non-luxury, and that holds that boundary in place. a process that gets restarted again when the settlement, when the boundary is disrupted during these times of socio-cultural change and industry threat. So I want to walk you through the components of that process one by one, abstracting from the empirical setting from the hotel industry to a more conceptual, more generalizable understanding of what's going on, and sort of show you how this pattern maps onto what's happening across the periods we've just delved into in a lot of detail. So we identified three mechanisms. Mechanisms are sort of the cogs and wheels of the process that adapts luxury in each period. These work together in each period, but a different mechanism ends up taking precedence in each period. So I'll show you this consistency and this difference over time, and I'll show you how they track in each period. I'll start by just introducing each of the three mechanisms. The first mechanism we called social partitioning. This is fundamentally about defining the ideal clientele, drawing the boundary around who belongs in luxury hotels and who's out. The second mechanism we called oppositional appropriation. This is at its core about borrowing elements from non-luxury, that's the opposition, and reframing them as luxury's own. Finally, the third mechanism we call temporal translation. This is about bringing the past into the present and using history as a strategic asset to set luxury apart from everything else, to set the elite apart from the non-elite. So in the Grand Hotel period, we see efforts to define luxury and distinguish it from non-luxury driven by social partitioning. When the category was new and had to establish who it was for, the new nation's rising elite class. This was supported with oppositional appropriation, the idea taken from taverns that the hotel was a public place, not something that was closed off. And it was supported by temporal translation, which elevated this past by looking to the long tradition of opulence in European hotels, reflected in imposing architecture and the design of American luxury hotels. Then in the chain hotel period, efforts to redefine luxury were led with the mechanism of oppositional appropriation, as luxury assumed elements of the chain hotel model that had originated in the middle of the market, standardizing and systematizing the experience. This was supported with social partitioning, which established that now luxury was for businessmen, lawyers, CEOs, and with temporal translation, with a renaissance of elegance that sought to elevate the chain model and revive the opulence of what was then seen a bygone era. Finally, during the lifestyle hotel period, when the category had matured and needed a way to feel rooted without feeling old, temporal translation widely romanticized luxury of the Grand Hotel period and updated it to today's tastes and priorities. This was supported with oppositional appropriation as luxury looked to boutique hotels that had risen in prominence and shifted from standardized opulence to a focus on design, local art, and craft amenities. And social partitioning established a new luxury clientele, not just CEOs or wealthy families, but a privileged creative class of artists, restaurateurs, designers, and more. So zooming out, we see that we need all three mechanisms in each period to define and redefine what distinguishes elite from non-elite. So there's a pattern of repetition in these mechanisms over time, and that they interlock together and do so in these times of emergence or change to define and distinguish elite from non-elite. And there's also difference across the periods as a distinct mechanism takes the lead and interlocks with others in each as well. Now, I want to unpack one other correlated insight of the study, that these mechanisms, this process, drives both settlement of the boundary, but also sows the seeds for eventual disruption of the boundary that sets luxury apart. In this way, elite status is not a permanent achievement. Instead, It's a temporary settlement that has to be repeatedly renegotiated. So every boundary holds two forces in balance: exclusivity, the sense that this is not for everyone, and cultural consonance, the sense that this fits with broader societal values right now. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, and I want to sort of wrap up my talk by allowing you to see it across all three eras at once. In the Grand Hotel era, the boundary balanced entitlement against progressivism. When progressive values intensified, entitlement tipped over into pretentiousness and the boundary fractured. So then in the chain hotel era, the boundary balances opulence against efficiency. Again, when efficiency becomes commonplace and society turns against mass production, the balance again breaks. So in the lifestyle hotel era, the current era, the boundary balances iconicity against authenticity. And if I were placing bets, I would watch closely here for where the next tension breaks. And the point is this: tip too far towards exclusivity and you lose your audience. You become out of step with the times. Tip too far towards consonance and you become indistinguishable from the mass market. You lose your distinction because heightened tensions result in boundary disruptions, these times when luxury was in crisis. Endurance then is the active work of keeping those two forces in productive tension and of adjusting the mix as the society around you changes. That is how elite status endures. And so, what are the implications in more concrete terms? I want to leave you with three practical lessons for anyone thinking about elite institutions or organizations or categories or brands. One, elite status is cultural, not just economic. You cannot buy your way to permanence. The meanings have to keep working, and meanings are shaped by the broader culture, not just by what you do within an industry or within your own four walls. Two, encoding a category as elite sows the seeds of its own disruption. The very things that make you elite today are the things your critics will use against you tomorrow. Plan for that. Watch your strengths the way you watch your weaknesses. And three, elite endurance requires adaptability on multiple dimensions at once: social, competitive, and historical. You have to read society, you have to watch your rivals, and you have to know your own past well enough to use it as raw material in order to be able to endure as elite over the very long term. So I'll leave you with maybe my favorite line from this entire program of research. It's from a luxury category expert I interviewed, and I think it very concisely captures really everything I've been trying to say today. This category expert told me, luxury is something you can repair. It doesn't get old, it gets better. It gets a patina. That, to me, is elite endurance in a single sentence. Not inertia, not unchanging preservation, but refinement and revision over time. So what's once elite may indeed remain elite virtually indefinitely, but it is not a foregone conclusion. Instead, the endurance of elite status is the result of a lot of deliberate cultural work. So with that, I thank you for joining me today, and I would love to take some of your questions. So one question is having a Michelin star restaurant in the building helpful? It's a good question. So I think this question we can kind of answer it in one of two ways, right? We can think about the importance of having certain facilities on premises, right? So luxury hotels widely are expected to have restaurant, a spa, a wide variety of amenities. And so Those expectations, though, have shifted over time. So what was expected in the Grand Hotel period was very different in terms of standard amenities from what was expected in the chain hotel period and what's expected in the lifestyle hotel period. In the chain hotel period, you likely wouldn't see a burger on the menu, for instance. Now, we see upscale sort of finger food that's actually seen as quite trendy and elite. So there's some usefulness in having these standard amenities and what they look like and what the precise mix of amenities and outlets might look like within a luxury hotel sort of shifts over time. I think the second way we can think about this question is around kind of arbiters of status. So critics and professional certifying bodies and what's the role that these play. And, the short answer is that right now, they remain important. But the importance of, again, arbiters of status or certifiers of status, if we take a longer view, has actually shifted pretty considerably over time. So like I was mentioning in the chain hotel period, we saw the rise of the Michelin star system, of the AAA diamond rating system. Previous to that, there hadn't been a certifying body, and there wasn't really a way to rank luxury hotels against one another. That was a challenge, by the way, in research design for this kind of work because there wasn't sort of a consistent measure of luxury over time, with something like Michelin just coming into being in the 1960s. So these certifying bodies are important to varying degrees over time. What we see currently is that they continue to play a role, but that role has shifted and changed with the rise of social media and online reviews, things like TripAdvisor. There's been a lot more power that has been ceded to guests who have more visibility to one another's opinions, who have more visibility to one another's reviews. These are sort of collated or summarized in industry awards that reflect guest opinions, so things like the Condé Nast Reader's Choice Awards and things like that. So all that to say, these certifying bodies do still matter and these standard amenities do still matter, but the degree to which they sort of determine or dictate whether a hotel is seen as elite or non-elite, whether a hotel is seen as luxury or non-luxury, has shifted over time, and the hold of these certifying bodies, in my view, has weakened somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat in this current era. So one of the other questions here, you started the presentation talking about how elite brands have shown remarkable durability, but then you talk about how each of the hotel periods shifted what was considered elite. Do you have an example of one brand that has actually shown that durability and shifted with each period, or should a brand not expect to remain elite through different periods? So there's not a single brand that I've seen persist over all three periods. If we think of a brand as sort of this corporate collection of numerous hotels, but there are hotels that have endured over this full period. So the Waldorf Astoria is a good example. The Plaza, the Drake in Chicago. There are a number of hotels that originated in the Grand Hotel period that have remained a member of the luxury hotel category and persisted as elite through virtually the industry's entire history. So to say that we shouldn't expect an ability to remain elite over the long term, I think that's overly pessimistic. I think there is reason to be optimistic about an ability of these individual hotels and individual brands to remain on top. If we take a relatively shorter time horizon, but a pretty considerable one regardless, we've still got brands like the Ritz-Carlton and the Four Seasons who have been able to adapt their offerings pretty considerably to align with these revised notions of what luxury is. So where Four Seasons. So I worked for the Four Seasons for a time. And one of the things that struck me when I worked for the Four Seasons was like how thick the training booklet was. So we had standard operating procedures where if you dropped this book on your foot, you would break your toe. And so it was highly standardized. And the goal was just as I was, sort of unpacking in the chain hotel era, it was the goal was that when you stayed at a Four Seasons, you had the same experience everywhere, and the rooms looked relatively consistent. There was just a high level of standardization, and that's what people wanted at the time. But as luxury has shifted, even a brand like Four Seasons, that was really emblematic of luxury in the chain hotel period, has found opportunity to adapt. So now we see the look and feel of various Four Seasons hotels being much more tailored to the locale, so that the Four Seasons in New York it has a different look and feel, even from the Four Seasons in Boston, and certainly different from the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills or elsewhere. So I think there is an ability for individual hotels and individual brands to remain elite over time. What it requires is a level of individual adaptivity that can be really challenging. And it's actually something that I'm looking at in another research project that's ongoing, where rather than looking sort of at this broad historical sweep, I'm looking inside hotels to try to understand how they adapt their offerings in a period of great ambiguity, like we saw in this shift from the chain hotel period to the lifestyle hotel period. So I don't have time to get into those findings now, but those are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about too, and that I think are really exciting. Just scrolling through questions here. I think we've got time maybe for one more, though. Um, John, you should feel free to cut me off if we're out of time. I'll take this one last question. When do you think the next indicator of elite status will be? What do you think the next indicator of elite status will be? And when do you think we will see that switch? So it's a really fascinating question, and one that I've tried to think a lot about. I don't have good answers, but I do think one of the other questions that I saw in the Q&A was around Airbnb and like this sort of hyper localization. I think we may begin to see some threats coming from that part of the industry. It's those threats have been put off because of some of the regulatory ambiguity around, how to treat Airbnbs and how to sort of wrangle them from a legal perspective. But I imagine, notions of authenticity are really those notions of authenticity that are important to luxury are now being instantiated in Airbnbs in a different way. And so that might be an interesting source of threat. What my research suggests is that even as we see a threat from below, in order for luxury really to come under threat, we'll also need to see a shift in socio-cultural sentiment. And it's harder for me to say when we might see that. But those are, I think, the two ingredients, right? That industry threat and that socio-cultural shifts. I imagine, or my research predicts, are the kinds of things that will lead to another redefinition in what luxury might mean.
Thank you so much, Professor Lockwood, for sharing these insights about the evolution of elite categories in luxury hotels. The historical examples that you shared were profoundly illuminating and really fascinating. And I know that our audience has learned a lot from your expertise today.
Well,
This
thank you. I'm
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
Thank you. And please feel free to email me with, we can continue the discussion. My email is on the website. So sorry.
Excellent. To discover more lifetime learning content, please visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Join us on June 17th for our virtual program, Reimagining the Declaration, to celebrate the 250-year impact of the Declaration of Independence. Thank you again, Professor Lockwood, and thank you, audience. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.